Dr. Sharachchandra Lele. He is a distinguished fellow environmental policy and governance at ATREE. He is also an adjunct professor at Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Pune. He has held positions in Pacific Institute for Cities, Harvard University, Tata Energy Research Institute, and the list goes on. I think I'd rather have the person himself come and talk about his work than just his achievements. But he's also founder member and past president of Indian Society for Ecological Economics. And today he will be speaking about understanding the Forest Rights Act. So please welcome Dr. Sharachchandra Lele. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and a special thanks to Hamsini for setting the stage for what I'm going to talk about. And of course, thanks to Mimi for inviting me to this very personal and wonderful event in remembrance of Mr. Parthasarathy. I first met Mr. Parthasarathy when I came to Bangalore as a master's student in, surprise, in the School of Automation in the Indian Institute of Science. And I went for a birding expedition with Zafar Fateli and Mr. Parthasarathy. And so in a sense, I met him as a fellow birdwatching enthusiast and a fellow wildlife lover. I met him several times where he organized many events in this vicinity. As you know, we were lucky to be based in the IISER campus. But of course, for Mr. Parthasarathy, birdwatching and wildlife were not just hobbies. They were his passion, they were his life. And in my own case, I was in transition from being trained as an electrical engineer to becoming an environmental studies person, as a professional environmental studies person, and an environmentalist in my life. So this was a transition point for me also. And I'm going to share a few things that I've learned through this transition from looking at birdwatching and wildlife as a hobby to not just looking at wildlife or conservation as a passion, but going beyond and looking at the environment and the social context of environment and environmental questions, both professionally and personally. So there are two things that I learned in this transition that I made, starting out as an engineer who had birdwatching as a hobby to an environmental scientist slash social scientist slash whatever you want to call me. Nitin is raising his eyebrows saying, what do we call guys like us who have lost our way? The two things that I would like to share with you, and I've requested this slide to be with us because I'm going to talk about something about a similar context in the Indian situation, and I'm not going to use any PowerPoint myself. So the challenge is actually for you that you have to listen to me without any wonderful visuals, and I hope I can communicate my points orally. So the first point that I'd like to share with you, the first learning, is that we cannot conserve wildlife or nature out there while living an unsustainable life in here or back here. All of us who are talking about wildlife conservation today are living city lifestyles, are living lifestyles which may be lower in carbon footprint than the average American, but are still in the top 10% of carbon footprints in India. We are the elite in India. We have incredibly consumptive lifestyles, whether it is of energy, water, or what have you. We have a high pollution footprint. We have a high water consumption footprint, not to mention the carbon footprint. And we really cannot talk about conservation out there while living this lifestyle back here. And when I say we cannot, it has both a sort of a practical significance and a philosophical or ethical significance. The practical significance is that one of the major threats for wildlife and biodiversity right now is climate change. If not the biggest threat, it's certainly one of the biggest threats is climate change. And climate change is not the result of some aborigines in Australia or some soligas in VR Hills consuming forest, but it is because of our lifestyles, our use of fossil fuels, to live this lifestyle, to be in an air-conditioned room or to drive a car to get here. That's the driver of climate change. And so we are the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss in today's context. And therefore, there is a physical link between what we do here and what happens out there. There is also a philosophical side to the story, which is that it is ethically incorrect for us to live the top 10% lifestyle and then ask the Adivasi in the forests of India to cut back, to not go into the forest, to stop grazing, to stop collecting firewood, which are their daily subsistence requirements, because we want to see the tiger when we go on a safari in Nagarhole National Park or Bandipur or whatever it is. I think that's a real ethical question there. And that relates to my second learning. And the second learning is that we need to acknowledge the deeply colonial and undemocratic history of conservation in particular, and natural resource governance in general in our country, and therefore make deep democratization a part of conservation action. And I say this knowing that it's easier to talk about the oppression of Aborigines in Australia because, as Hamsani said, it was recent. There's a very clear black and white divide, if you want to call it. There's a pre-contact and a post-contact, almost a year that you can put there. Whether it's 1492 for the Americas or some later year for Australia, there's a very clear skin difference, skin color difference. So we can easily absorb this idea, and you can see that also now reflected in the Australian government talking at least lip service about recognizing the injustice caused on Aborigines when Australia was colonized. It's much harder for us. It's much harder for us to talk about colonization, or we say, yes, of course, we were colonized by the Brits, and so we are all victims. We are all victims of the colonization. So we are in fact all Aborigines, we are all Indians who were colonized by the Brits, and so we are all fellow sufferers. And in that process, we actually obliterate the internal divisions in our country, the continuation of colonial practices post 1947, and therefore the need to talk about the rights of forest dwelling or indigenous communities. Even though we say we are a democratic country, we are not a deeply democratic country. We still have a lot of things to answer for. And the Forest Rights Act is basically using this as the starting point. The idea of historic injustice on forest dwellers and the idea of democratic rights of people who live close to forests or inside forests. These are the twin pillars of the Forest Rights Act, the idea of historic injustice that needs to be corrected, and the idea of the need for recognizing the democratic rights over one's immediate environment. And to sort of bolster that second point, I would like to point out that when we in Bangalore agitate against the flyover, the steel flyover proposal, I'm sure many of you were part of that agitation to stop the steel flyover proposal, or we talk about solid waste not being managed properly in Bangalore and so on. In a sense, we are trying to expand our democratic right. We are saying that as citizens of Bangalore, I need to have a bigger say in what happens in my ward, my locality. It should not be somebody sitting in Vidhan Sauda or somebody sitting in Delhi who dictates, or somebody who strikes contracts with some contractor, and then what happens on the ground is something totally different. So we believe in democratic rights of citizens as long as they affect us, as long as we are the ones exercising this right. And what the Forest Rights Act says, in that case, forest dwellers also have democratic rights over their environment, and we need to recognize them in the law, not just as a sort of a corollary of the 73rd Amendment. So what is this word historic injustice? Let me just go back to that a bit. What is this historic injustice that the Forest Rights Act is talking about? Well, there are layers and layers to that historic injustice. And I'll give you a real example, and then I'll spell out the detailed layers of historic injustice. And the example comes from the Biligiri Rangan Hills of Karnataka itself. So when I first started thinking about and reading about the Forest Rights Act, I thought, oh, this is basically something that happened in central India. This is the kind of stuff that Adivasis in central India are facing, the kind of problems that they are facing is over there, and nothing really to do with Karnataka. And to an extent that may be true, just because the Adivasi population in Karnataka is really small. But when we dug up the records of the declaration of the reserve forest, in those days called state forest, Dodsampige State Forest. So the notification is 1891, and it makes very interesting reading, because it supposedly follows the Indian Forest Act of 1878, and the British colonizers prided themselves in doing things by the law. So that's why they promulgated the Forest Act. They didn't just go in and take over the forest. They wanted to look like they were doing something lawful. So they have 1878 Forest Act, And the Act says that if you want to declare something as a reserve forest, then you must actually investigate into pre-existing rights of people who may be living in and around that particular forest. So they have done the settlement of rights of Dotsampige Reserve Forest, and it makes very interesting reading, because it says basically, yes, Nallikadru is a Podu, and there are Soligas living there, and the rights that we recognize of those Soligas is ½ acre of their village settlement, 1 acre of their graveyard, which is 5 miles away from the village settlement, rights to access a stream which is 3 miles away from the river from the settlement, the right to pray at the shrine which is 2 miles away from that settlement. End of story. So the rights that are recognized of people who have been living in a forest for millennia are basically, you can pray, you can drink water, you can breathe, you can live in your hut. So you're supposed to live on air and water and prayer, right? No shifting cultivation rights, which was their traditional livelihood. No hunting rights, of course. No gathering rights in the forest for even firewood, let alone non-timber forest products or amla or honey or something like that. Nothing. And this is your very legal settlement of rights in the Dotsampige Reserve Forest. And this process was replicated basically all across the country. So the 4 or 5 layers of historic injustice you have that the Forest Rights Act is sort of speaking to, the first and foremost, which actually the Act doesn't do much about, is the right to continue shifting cultivation, which was taken away by the British. But they also did not recognize the right to settle cultivation in many parts of the country, and that non-recognition continued after 1947, when the forest estates of different Rajas were merged with the State Forest Department's estate, and the Rajas called something a game reserve, and that became a reserve forest just by the stroke of a pen, without recognizing that the Raja was not bothered about people living and cultivating in the game reserve, as long as his hunting was successful. Whereas when you convert it into reserve forest, then everybody inside becomes an encroacher. So the right to settle cultivation was lost in many parts. The biggest loss across the whole country was the right to access and manage your forest. Not just access, but also manage the forest in your vicinity as per your customs and traditions and requirements. And then following that, when you come to the 1970s and 80s, you have 2 more injustices that get piled onto that, because your original existence is not recognized. The forest does not belong to you, it belongs to the State Forest Department. So then what happens is that when it comes to declaring something as a wildlife sanctuary or as a national park, you have no rights there anyway. There's a whole forest where you have been living, you have been collecting firewood, grazing animals, collecting non-timber forest products, even historically hunting, but you have no rights because nothing is on paper. Therefore, you have no rights, and therefore you can be evicted. So the eviction of people in the name of conservation, that starts happening very strongly after 1972. And then the 1980 so-called Forest Conservation Act, which we are seeing pretty much the death of that now as of today. But the 1980 Forest Conservation Act says the central government must be consulted, and it must give its permission to the diversion of forest for, let's say, a railway line, a dam, a coal mine, or whatever it is. Fine. So you want somebody above the state government to be, regulating this process, but you do not recognize the right or the voice, consent, or at least consultation of the local community, which is going to be the most affected. When 500 hectares of a dense forest in the middle of Orissa or Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand is diverted for a coal mine, who is first going to be affected? The impact on climate is very small. 500 hectares in the global picture is very small. But the impact on the local community, which depends on the forest, which has cultural attachment to the forest, there might be 10 villages which are massively affected. But they are not at all in the picture when making those decisions. So that's your 5th injustice, which is that there is no local voice in the conversion of forest to non-forest. You have the state's voice, you have the center's voice, but nothing about the local communities. So that's the kind of injustice that we are talking about. It is historic, it has continued after 1947, and the FRA is an attempt to rectify that historic injustice by recognizing that those who had at least settled cultivation have the right to continue their settled cultivation. So this canard that has been spread about the FRA, that it is about distributing forests, at 4 hectares per tribal and multiply by so many million tribals, so many million hectares of forest is going to be lost, is a complete falsehood, because it is about continuing to cultivate, and the right to continue cultivation that was not recognized as cultivation earlier when settling the forest boundary. That is number one. But number two, which is the most important right in the FRA, which has been the least implemented also, is the right of communities to collectively access and manage their forest in their vicinity within their traditional customary boundary. That's called the CFR right. Many of us call it CFRs. And the implementation of CFR rights has been very poor. As Siddhappa will tell you, the Bidigi Rangaswamy sanctuary is one of the first protected areas in the country to get recognized CFR rights of the communities. And we are still trying to figure out how to actually use them in practice on the ground to change conservation and make it into co-management. So I will stop here and say that the FRA, it's a vast subject and we could go on and on, but we really need to engage with this idea of democratizing conservation, recognizing the democratic rights of people who have been living in these areas. They have democratic rights, they have a right to the correction of historic injustice. Thank you.